Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix Jr. have been a joy to watch.
This is Locked On Sports Atlanta, and it's time for the Atlanta Football Party, only on Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Atlanta Football Party, your home for the best Atlanta Falcons football talk. It's local insight you can't get anywhere but right here at Locked On. I'm your host, Tenitra Batiste. Alongside me are Jarvis Davis, Aaron Freeman, and Tori McElhaney. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And our Atlanta Football Party is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, the Falcons are kicking off mandatory minicamp this week. We'll talk expectations for each position group and position battles on the offensive side of the ball. Then we'll talk defense and special teams. But first, let's talk about who's impressed so far during OTAs. And as I mentioned, we're heading into mandatory minicamp for the Falcons this week. Jarvis, who's impressed you the most so far? And that could be a player, coach, or even moves in the front office. And who would you like to see impress you before this team breaks for training camp?
I think one of the things that impressed me the most is when I was out at practice last week or a couple weeks ago. You know, sometimes all this stuff runs together for me this time of year. But when just to see Michael Penix out there, well, you know, you hear about, the arm strength, you hear about the accuracy, you talk about things translating from the college game into the NFL and those traits, right? We talked about those all the time, specifically on this show, is to see a deep ball that he threw to Chris Blair, where Chris Blair had beat his man, gave him a nice little stem at the top of his route, and then he was just running. The ball was in the air, and I was just like, oh my gosh, is it gonna land right there? And all he did, he slightly just put his hands out there, and the ball was right there in the brass basket. I feel like it could have been a better throw if he would have just walked it to him and put it right in his hand. I was just like, oh my gosh, because given what we've been seeing in the past couple of years, like we just seen some bad quarterback play, right? So to be able to see, Michael Penix live and in person and doing what he does best, which is connecting on that deep ball, I feel like it was just really cool to see. I was just like, man, I know these wide receivers. They probably won't say it, but I know they're among themselves. They're like, man, this year it's gonna be something really good this year. And Kirk not too bad himself.
So yeah, Tori, it's probably one of those where it's like, yeah, you can't say it or you won't say it, wide receiver or pass catching core, but we'll say it for you. Yeah, Michael Penix Jr. is definitely one who, when I went out there as well, and I didn't see him do too many deep balls, it was just some quick tosses, but impressive nonetheless. But who's impressed you so far throughout this whole period of off-season training activities?
Yeah, I mean, I'll stick with the same kind of thread of conversation where we're talking about quarterbacks. I mean, I have to say Kirk Cousins because, and it's not necessarily like just him alone, though. To me, it's the connection that he has with Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Bijan Robinson, Darnell Mooney, Rondale Moore, like all of these, like what you're talking about, his offensive weapons and the guys that he's throwing to, because right now in OTAs, because there's no contact, it's really hard for me to see and to really point out any defensive players that have really surprised me, because you're pigeonholing them and they can't do 90% of what they need to be able to do, which is tackling and being a defender. And so it's really hard to pick a defensive guy that really stands out, but I surely can pick Kirk Cousins and how he gets the ball into the hands of his playmakers and how they're communicating and how they are kind of tweaking things and doing things a little bit differently. I think that to me is what stood out the most during this time period, because it's the one thing that you really can see.
Yeah. And Aaron, I would say the same. It feels like there's some seamlessness early on, if that's such a word, but some connectivity that you have to be impressed with this early on in the process. But yeah, for you, Free, who maybe has impressed you so far with what you've seen coming out of OTAs?
Well, this is the part of the offseason where it's really about the quarterbacks and the receivers, as Tori explained. Like the defense isn't really doing much. You're not really getting much in the trenches. So, I guess I'll pick another quarterback. I got to toss up between Taylor Heineke and John Paddock. So let's go with John Paddock, just because he doesn't get enough love as the fourth quarterback on the roster. Just a guy out there doing his job, trying to impress to maybe get a shot at a practice squad spot. So yeah, we'll see what the quarterbacks could do. This is kind of their time of the offseason.
Right. Well, if you think about it, you're absolutely right, because this could be one of those situations where who knows? He could be sneaky good and he could kind of sneak into that third spot. Hey, stranger things have happened. And like Jarvis said, we've seen enough shaky play under center these last couple of seasons where, I don't know, the bar for the third quarterback may not actually be that high. So you never know if maybe he'll sneak up and kind of pass Taylor Heineke in that regard. But speaking of Free, is there anyone who you're saying, hey, haven't quite seen, or I want to see something out of that particular player maybe before training camp, so that it'll kind of prepare you to say, okay, I've seen this part. Now I need to see one more thing so I can prepare my eyes and ears for training camp?
Well, for me, like, again, it's really about, the connection between the quarterback and the receivers. And, I saw Jarvis post a video like a week or two ago about Kyle Pitts moving. And so, like, I don't think Kyle Pitts has to prove anything, but it is nice to sort of see Kyle Pitts doing things again and looking 100%. So, like, that's probably the person I would circle.
Yeah. And Tori, I would think, someone like a Kyle Pitts, we're all kind of intrigued, like, ooh, let's see what we see these last couple of days that we get to see him, or even what we've seen out of him these last couple of weeks ahead of training camp. But is there anyone where you're like, let me see one or two more things for that particular player, and that'll kind of set the stage for you in what you want to see in them out of training camp?
The thing is like, I want to see, obviously I've been talking about it, like this defense, I think, is really intriguing just from a holistic standpoint. And I do want to see kind of who emerges as the other starting quarterback opposite AJ Terrell. I know that decision, we're a ways off from making that decision, I would assume. But at this point in time, this is all stuff that, like, we have to start thinking about as we get closer and closer to training camp. So even though one day of mandatory mini camp isn't going to necessarily change my viewpoint on, or I think any of the coaches on what they do at that position between Mike Hughes or Clark Phillips, like, I think that it's going to be something that we're talking about all the way even up to the season and maybe even into the season. But that's a position that I very much have my eye on, even though you can't really tell at this point in time what direction they're going in, what guys, have a leg up or don't. So that's kind of just where I am. That's just a position of intrigue that I have.
Oh, yeah, understandably so.
And, I think I thought Aaron made a really great point when you talk about Kyle Pitts, because there was something that kind of stood out to me while I was out there, just watching practice and everything. Because one of the things that I know I had to deal with as a player, because sometimes I didn't realize how big I was. I know that might be hard to believe, and sometimes that might leak onto the field to where I didn't even necessarily play as if I was my size, right? So I think that, watching, Kyle Pitts go up against Clark Phillips, in the red zone, obviously when you look at it, 6'6" versus 5'7", 5'8", 5'9", whatever you want to throw in there. Aaron, don't laugh at me, man. I'm trying to stay focused here. So, when you see Kyle Pitts when he's running his route, he kind of like giving him like a little shoulder, like get off me, type thing. And then as soon as he turned around, the ball was like right there. Kirk threw it right to him. He put it right in the breadbasket. I was like, I looked at one of the reporters that I was talking to. I was like, hey, it's nothing you can do about that. Yeah. Absolutely nothing you can do about that. And for him to be working on those things in this moment, like, I even tweeted out, I had tweeted out about it. Of course, you had the naysayers. He's supposed to do that. But when he's doing what he's supposed to do, that's what you want, right? Because he's 6'6", 225, 235, running a 4.4. Yeah, of course. Yeah, you want to see those. Yeah, he's supposed to do that moments. We need to see more of that, specifically in the red zone. So it was kind of cool to see how, Kyle Pitts is kind of growing into his body in the NFL. Of course, in college, you can kind of, run free and do your thing, but it's another thing to be able to do that on the NFL level. And that's what we expect to see.
Yeah, and it sounded like that was a little bit of edgy KP working against Clark Phillips. Now, that's another thing that I love to see. And I think going back to what you were saying, Tori, about sort of the connection activity that Kirk Cousins has with his, I'll call it the pass catcher core. But I think in addition to what you said about what he's doing in terms of getting the best out of these guys, as far as his throwing, and they're receiving balls from an accurate a passer who can actually get the ball to them. I think, too, the way that he operates, the way that he moves, the way that he thinks, the way that he's setting the tone for this team, especially when you can't do much in the absence of pads, I think that's actually shining through slowly but surely. And when I hear about KP doing something like that, that's what I think about. Like, yep, you're kind of seeing Cousins, his edge, hate to use the cliche-ish term, but his swag, the way he approaches the game, I think can rub up on these younger players in a good way and kind of help them to elevate not just their physical game, but also their mindset and kind of the way that they approach the game overall. So speaking of that, when we come back, we'll talk about expectations for each position group and any position battles that there might be. We're going to go offense first in the deep dive. This episode of our Atlanta Football Party is brought to you by FanDuel. Summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and more, and you can bet it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet everything from the finals MVP to who's going to hit one out of the park. So if you are a local fan of the Atlanta Braves, then it wasn't a good day for the Braves, but hey, at least the Phillies lost too, because the Mets absolutely did damage over in London. So if you bet on the Mets for once, you might have bet well. And of course, the NBA Finals are in full gear. The Boston Celtics, of course, went up 2-0 on the Dallas Mavericks Sunday night. It was a back and forth, but ultimately speaking, with Boston taking that 2-0 lead into Dallas, here's the thing. 31-5 all time when a team is leading 2-0 in the finals. The Celtics, as a franchise, 43-1 record overall when leading a best-of-7 series 2-0. So might be a good look for you to go Boston with FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Add a big win to your summer bucket list because FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. All right, guys. So again, we talked about this earlier, the fact that in a couple days, there will be a nice break, not just for the players, but for us as well, to kind of reset ourselves before training camp begins on July 27th. So wanted to kind of talk to you guys about like just a little bit more of a drill down on each of the position groups. And if you see anyone who's kind of starting to separate themselves, and I'll be honest, I think not just the separation from a physical perspective, but maybe if you're seeing some things where a player is mentally approaching the game differently, I wanted to hear from you on that. So, Free, from your perspective, when you look at that quarterback room, I mean, we kind of chuckled about the fourth QB, but is there anything that you're seeing as far as that group? Obviously, there's no position battle per se, but just maybe any type of thing that has shown you, okay, this is kind of one thing about Kirk Cousins that maybe we didn't know before we saw him in OTAs as a Falcon, or Michael Penix Jr., or even if there's anything new you've seen in Taylor Heinicke.
Well, I know when the offseason began and the Falcons decided to retain Taylor Heinicke, a player that a lot of people thought was going to get cut, they basically said that they were planning on, drafting, competition for him. And obviously the Falcons put the highest possible pick they possibly could in a quote unquote backup player in Michael Penix Jr. And sort of, I think the assumption all along is like, we'll see Penix Jr. be the number 2 quarterback, but it makes also sense for the Falcons to keep all 3 guys, with Taylor Heinicke being that 3rd quarterback. So I'm very curious to sort of see that competition, if we get a competition in earnest once training camp kicks off, right? Mm-hmm. Like we're now at a point in the offseason where, as we've already kind of discussed, like you're not really competing for jobs. It's really the learning phase. It's like everybody's trying to learn a new offense, learn a new defense, and just sort of getting, especially for the young players that haven't been around, just sort of getting their process and a system in which they can approach each and every day, learning how to be a professional football player, that sort of thing. And so I'm very curious to sort of see, once training camp kicks off, like how those backup quarterback reps are going to be split up. Is Heinicke going to get the bulk of them, with the Falcons fully preparing for Penix to get a full redshirt season, right? Mm-hmm. Which is one choice that they could make, or are the Falcons going to try to bring Penix along quicker than that? and potentially him surpass Heineke for some of those second team reps. So that to me is kind of the intriguing conversation about the quarterback. And then of course, if John Paddock can make a couple of throws that make people go, ooh la la, that will also help his chances of maybe sticking on a practice squad or something.
Yeah. And Tori, I was listening to something probably yesterday, if you will, where a reporter was going around the NFC South, right? And kind of breaking everything down by each position. And I thought it was interesting because when that reporter broke down the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the only kind of edge that the reporter gave to the Bucs over the Falcons was at the wide receiver position, but that was primarily based on Mike Evans. So I thought that was interesting because I said to myself, Tori, the Falcons have Drake London, and now Drake London has Kirk Cousins. So I feel like with that in mind, he could potentially be that guy who, not to say he's going to produce at the Mike Evans level immediately, but who's to say that he can't? And I think this is one of those very intriguing rooms because you kind of known what a wide receiver one could be, but now you have all of these sort of, I'll call them variables because you don't quite know what a Rondale Moore or a Darnell Mooney will be. But ultimately speaking, I think this might be one of the most intriguing position groups because, to your point, we've had a little bit more opportunity to see maybe what they can do than maybe some of the other position groups on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, I think this is a group that I personally am really excited to see because they differ so much from a schematic standpoint, from a look standpoint of what an Arthur Smith receiver was in this in the last 3 years here. They're very different. I think I've said this before. They're all under like 6 foot. They all run a sub 4.5. They are quick and speedy and compact. And then you have Drake and Kyle kind of adding your height and kind of your big mismatch opportunities. But I think that there is a lot of people who are sleeping on this wide receiver core. Yeah. And I think that's a mistake because you also look at the Sean McVay coaching tree and you look at kind of the offensive scheme and how receivers are used in that scheme. I'm not saying that, it's going to look exactly the same here in Atlanta, but there's a reason you went out and got the specific guys that you got. You're talking about Ray McLeod, Darnell Mooney, Moore. There's a specific reason you got that body type and that speed and that ability to stretch the field vertically. I just think that's going to it's going to come into play, and it's going to come into play early because you have a guy like Kirk Cousins in the pocket who Darnell Mooney says, like, I just got to make sure I'm in the right position. I know the ball's going to be there. I just got to get there. And I think that there is something to be said about that dynamic and kind of how the front office has pieced together this position group around Drake London.
Mm-hmm. I'm also intrigued, Jarvis, around the running back room because obviously last week, the story of stories that came out of Flowery Branch was the comparison to Christian McCaffrey and kind of utilizing Bijan Robinson as such. And I, for one, believe easily he can be that. And I think if you may have to go a little bit further back to college, but if you kind of compare the stats, that's not far off to think that Bijan could do CMC type things, even on the NFL level. But let me ask you this. In addition to Bijan, we saw some growth in Tyler Allgeier as being a solid pass catcher. So I think for me, I'm more intrigued to kind of see how he'll be utilized and what is it that Zac Robinson's offense will be able to do to continue to see the evolution, not just of Bijan, but also of Tyler Allgeier?
Yeah, I think, Tyler Allgeier should be the sledgehammer in this offense, right? Because when you think about what he brings to the table, that dude just runs with such a ferocity that you just can't. It can get like overwhelming in the third and fourth quarter, right? Because especially when you've been hit with Bijan and trying to make sure I chop my feet when I come down, break down, because he might shake me out my shoes and everything. Then next thing you know, you got this guy come slamming into you, just like, all right, I'm gonna run you over while you're sitting there chopping your feet. So it's just I'm really intrigued by how Zac Robinson is going to utilize these guys. I know everybody talking about, oh yeah, we're going to throw the ball all around the yard and everything. Like, and I was talking to Jake Matthews. I was out there and he was just saying, like, hey, it's obvious that an offensive lineman wants to be able to run the ball, right? But he knows that they're going to pass the ball. But I think if they can establish themselves within this 11 personnel and not necessarily running these 12 personnel so much, like Arthur Smith was so in love with, I feel like this can be a dangerous offense. And when you talk about having a guy like Bijan Robinson who can just be so dynamic, right, at any moment. And then you got a guy like Tyler Allgeier coming in just to pound your behind towards the end of the game. It can be very, very interesting. And I think that that's probably one of the more intriguing things in this offense for me, as to watch once they are putting the pads on.
To that point too, I will add, it's what's really interesting, and I think the best coordinators understand this, is that you play to the strengths of what you have.
Absolutely.
And we know that the strength of this offensive line is running the ball. It's run blocking, especially that right side with Chris Lindstrom and Caleb McGarry. That is an area that is such a major strength for this team and has been for the last couple of years. So if you're Zac Robinson, you're not trying to like completely, change things up 110%. It's just like, we're just going to have Kirk Cousins throw the ball around the yard. No, you still have one of the best run blocking offensive lines, I'll say, in the league. I mean, the stats back that up. And then to have Tyler Allgeier and to have Bijan Robinson, you're exactly right. It's not like they're going to completely change what they're doing and throw the ball 80% of the time. No, you have a really intriguing and successful establishment running the ball at this point in time. It's why you paid these offensive linemen what you paid them. So that to me just goes along with all of this. I think you just raised a good point that just made me think. It was like, yes, they're going to do all these things with these receivers, and you're going to see dynamic passes from Kirk Cousins and everything like that. But don't forget, at the end of the day, that this offense's bread and butter over the last couple of years has been running the ball.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because that's exactly where I was going to go. As Jarvis was talking, I'm like, yeah, that would be something that would make Caleb McGarry very, very happy, because that's where he thrives. But real talk, that's actually where the entire O-line thrives. And Free, I saw an article that was a little bit controversial if you read down in the comments, but it was basically saying that the best 13th and 31st duo pick of the decade were Chris Lindstrom and Caleb McGarry. And for that very reason, because of what they're able to do as an O-line in protecting for run plays. And I saw something else that got a lot of comments, and, chime in however you guys want to as we kind of wrap this up. But another comment that I saw was, why would this be a run first offense if you got Kirk Cousins? Because of the runners that you have, and because of the O-line that you have, and because at the end of the day, if you actually want to go somewhere deep in the postseason, you're going to have a strong run attack to complement that passing attack. So I love, and you guys know, the O-line is my favorite group. You already know that. So I'm always excited to talk about them, but that's probably the group that I'm intrigued just to kind of see as they continue to solidify themselves Free as one of the top 10, if not top 5 O-lines in all of the NFL.
Well, piggybacking on your point, why would they want to run the football? Kirk Cousins coming off an Achilles injury and getting back into what he was doing the last couple of years in Minnesota, where they weren't running the ball. They were just basically throwing it every single down. They had Justin Jefferson. They had TJ Hawkinson. That's why they drafted Jordan Addison in the first round, because it's like, if we're going to throw the ball 45 times a game, we need more weapons here in this offense. And, while the Falcons wide receiver core is an up-and-coming unit, they're not quite at that level. We need to see what Drake London and Kyle Pitts and Darnell Mooney and all those guys can be to be that type of offense. And then you have these first couple of games against the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Eagles and the Chiefs. You don't want to get into this pure drop back passing attack with some of those pass rushers coming to town. Like, you want to be able to run the football down their throats, and that's going to be a big part of the Falcons' success early in the season if they can really establish the run. And Tori talking about the right side being one of the best run blocking offensive lines in the league. And that's really what's going to sort of solidify this unit as one of those premier units. If the left side can get like that with Matthew Bergeron and Jake Matthews as well, and with Drew Dalman sort of being that pivot in the middle of that offensive line. So I think when folks sort of assume that, hey, we got Kirk and now we're going to throw the ball a million times a game, it's like, we have the capacity to be able to win that way if we get into those sort of, left-handed contests and whatnot. But I think the goal of the Falcons is to be a balanced offense that's going to be able to utilize, Bijan Robinson and Tyler Allgeier as sort of breadwinners in this offense.
Indeed. When we come back, we'll talk about expectations for position groups and maybe some position battles on the defensive side of the ball in the deep dive, part 2. Locked On Sports Today is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel and is programmed to bring you the biggest stories daily without all the noise. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news. Streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So guys, let's continue the combo about what we want to see. And I know it's a little bit different when we're talking defense, because to Tori's earlier point, what it is that they do best, how it is that we'd be able to evaluate, you can't quite see without pads and without the ability to tackle. But we do still kind of know that there are certain things that we're looking to see, even when we think about our defensive ends, for example. And, Free, I might start with a Grady Jarrett. Like, we don't know. This is the first time in his career that we've ever seen him have an injury that took him out for the majority of the season. And this is an older Grady Jarrett that's coming back. So I'm very intrigued to see what we're going to see out of Grady when he returns. But what do you think about that, just in terms of not just what we'll see from Grady at the defensive end position, but also Zach Harrison and maybe that level up that you're looking for with him?
Yeah, I think when you look at this defensive front, you're looking at that sort of interior group of D linemen, where that includes Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata and Zach Harrison as sort of the strength of this front, right? They're going to be able to get interior pressure. And the question is going to be, can the Falcons get reliable pressure on the outside from some of the edge rushers? And that's going to be something intriguing to watch later this summer. But yeah, I think the big question with this interior group is just how good a player is Grady Jarrett going to be coming back from his injury. Like, I think Grady played well last year, but it wasn't necessarily the sort of rebound all pro type of season that I think a lot of us thought going into the season that he would have, given the upgrades that the Falcons had in terms of his supporting guys. We've been clamoring for 3+ years, if not 10 years, it seems like, get Grady some help on that D line. And, we did. And, it led to a big improvement for the defense as a whole, but you didn't necessarily see that reflected truly in Grady Jarrett's individual play, although he played well. Again, Grady, I've never seen Grady Jarrett have a bad game, but like, it's one of those things where you do wonder a little bit before the injury if he was slowing down a little bit, and then that's a big question mark about what he's going to be post-injury. But it's Grady Jarrett, so he's the leader of this defense. You expect him to be given as much room to sort of return, but I do wonder a little bit as we get later in the summer. Are we going to see Grady Jarrett kind of on a pitch count a little bit, just to sort of keep him fresh as possible, so that we don't get into the season where he's playing, 65-70% of the snaps like he was early last year due to the lack of D-line rotation. And I think that's really where guys like Zach Harrison and Rukaroro and Brandon Dorless, all these young pieces that are just kind of there, to kind of eat snaps for Grady Jarrett, to keep him fresh as possible. And in the process of that, you also see those guys grow and develop and potentially be, difference makers in the interior of that Falcons D line for, the next 5 to 10 years, like Grady Jarrett has been for the last decade. So, I think that D line group, collectively is where a lot of the intrigue is up front moving forward, where you have a lot more proven options and some unproven guys that are up and comers. But I know that edge rush group also is going to be very intriguing, because you don't know quite what you have in that group right now.
When it comes to that group too, I mean, I really look at Grady Jarrett as being kind of this guy that he will be better when you have more of an ability to move people in and out around him and with him. And and to your point, and not playing, 75% of the defensive snaps. What's been really interesting over the course of OTAs is how this up front, honestly, this front seven to a certain extent, maybe not the inside linebackers, but they almost have been rotating in like hockey lines, like really and truly. And I know that was something that Ryan Nielsen talked about last year a lot, and wanting to keep guys fresh, but injuries kind of made that almost nearly impossible. This group is very deep. And whether you're talking about the interior guys or you're talking about the guys coming off the edge. And what was really interesting, even early in OTAs, and I don't think they were doing this by design. Maybe they were just trying to see what they had. But it was so funny, because it was like, if a guy had been playing in the league for 4+ years, he was with one group. If he had been in the league less than 3 years, he was with another group. And they were kind of rotating it in that way by youth versus experience. And then they started mixing and matching as time has gone on, which I found to be a very interesting strategy, because we know that like a lot of these young guys are going to get I would say a lot of reps. You got them for a reason, and you have an opportunity for them to step into to playing time. Let's be honest. Especially if you have David Onyemata and Grady Jarrett, who are, let's be honest, the twilight years of their careers. You need to be able to have some young bucks around them to give them a breather so that they can continue to perform at their best. So all of that to me is very interesting when we're talking about this defensive front.
Yeah, I think that, a guy that I'm really interested to see how he kind of continues to develop in Arnold Ebiketie. Obviously, we would have like for him to kind of be, make that big jump. Like, we're talking about like going from 4 or 5 sacks to 9 or 10 or even 11 or 12. Like, so, but I feel like he's a guy that I feel like there's going to be something quite interesting with him, because I felt like there were times last year where he would beat his man and then the quarterback will either get rid of the football or he'll roll out somewhere. Somebody didn't keep their lane, and then he was able to get outside the opposite of Arnold Ebiketie, and he ended up missing the sack. So I feel like there is something there with him. And also that other outside linebacker edge spot, right? Zoe's been out there for a little bit. I've always said that, hey, Lorenzo Carter, at this point in his career, he isn't a starter. He's a nice rotational piece. And I feel like Braden Trice might be the guy that, Tori mentioned, like, hey, to be able to get that a significant amount of playing time if you, do what you were drafted to do, right? Because that's why they took him, in the 3rd round. So I feel that the outside linebacker edge spot is going to be very interesting to me, like, especially when they get the pads on, because you want to see guys kind of step up and say, hey, I'm the guy. I understand this whole rotational stuff, but yeah, I want to be in there 65, I wanted to be 65, 35, and I got that right. Wow, I'm great. All right, so 65, 35. Right. So you want them to be in that space where they're, when it's 3rd and long, hey, I can count on this guy. I can count on 48, or I can count on 0. If Carter Zoe makes that jump, that kind of old man jump, right? Or that old man steady, exactly what you can expect for him on 3rd and long. So I feel like Arnold Ebiketie, Braden Trice, and Lorenzo Carter, that group right there is going to be very interesting to watch, because like somebody's going to have to come out of top. Somebody got to rise to the top.
Yeah. And there's more to unpack, but hey, you guys are always with us each and every week. So if you want to unpack more with us on special teams, couple other position groups on the defensive side of the ball, and any other happenings that go on throughout this mandatory mini camp week, come back next week to the Atlanta Football Party. And of course, be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're free and available wherever you download your podcasts. We'll see you also tomorrow on the Atlanta Football Party, the Dogs edition.